The morning started like any other morning on Earth. In Lagos, street vendors were setting up their stalls before sunrise, the smell of fried food mixing with the warm, humid air. In Mumbai, millions of people were already on the move, filling trains and roads with the usual noise of a city that never truly slept. In Sao Paulo, children were getting ready for school. In Tokyo, office workers were buying coffee from small shops near train stations. In New York, the sun was still below the horizon, and the city was just beginning to breathe again after a long night. Nobody was looking up at the sky. Nobody had a reason to. Earth had known about alien life for 62 years. The first contact had happened quietly, without drama. A signal detected by a deep space array near Jupiter, decoded over the course of 4 years, and finally answered with a simple mathematical sequence. The response came back in 9 months. After that, contact became regular. Within 20 years, humanity had been formally introduced to the Galactic Concord, a large political body made up of 47 different alien species, spread across a huge section of the known galaxy. It should have been the greatest moment in human history. In many ways, it was. Scientists celebrated. Governments formed new departments overnight. Schools changed their entire programs. Philosophers wrote long books about what it all meant. The world was excited, buzzing, full of hope. But the Galactic Concord looked at humanity the way a wealthy, powerful family looks at a distant, poor relative who shows up uninvited at a dinner party. They were polite. They answered questions. They gave humanity a small seat at the edge of the table. But they never truly welcomed them. They never truly respected them. The Concord species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Some of them had civilizations older than human writing. They had medicines that could regrow lost limbs. They had energy sources that could power entire planets. They had weapons that could crack open moons. And humans? Humans had only left their own solar system 40 years ago. They were new. They were small. They were considered primitive. The Vreth Dominion in particular had very little patience for humanity. The Vreth were a reptilian species, tall, heavily built, with dark green and gray scales that covered their bodies like armor. They came from a hot, dry world called Vreth Prime, deep in the eastern part of the galaxy. Their civilization was built on conquest. For over 300 years, they had expanded their empire by finding weaker species, taking their resources, and either forcing them into service or wiping them out entirely. They were feared across the Concord. Even other powerful species were careful around the Vreth. The Vreth had noticed Earth for a long time. The solar system that Earth sat in was rich, far richer than most people on Earth understood. The asteroid belts alone contained enough rare metals and minerals to fuel an interstellar civilization for centuries. The gas giants held enormous quantities of elements that were difficult to find elsewhere. And Earth itself, sitting in a perfect position from its star, had biological diversity that certain Vreth scientists had been quietly cataloging for years. The Vreth wanted it. They had wanted it for a long time. But for years, they had held back, not out of respect, and not out of fear. They held back because taking a system inside the Concord's general territory without permission created political problems. There were rules, even among powerful empires, and Vreth were smart enough to work with rules when it suited them. So, they worked quietly. They pushed in the Concord chambers to keep humanity's membership application delayed. They spread information, some of it true and some of it not, about how dangerous and unstable humans were. They painted a picture of a violent, chaotic species that could not be trusted with full membership rights. And every year, humanity's formal application to join the Galactic Concord as a full member was voted down or tabled, or simply ignored. Without full membership, Earth had no protection under Concord law. That was the detail the Vreth had been waiting on. When their scouts confirmed that Earth's deep space military capacity was still limited, that humanity had warships, yes, but nothing close to what a real interstellar power would field, the Vreth High Command made their decision. They had waited long enough. The resources in the human solar system were too valuable. The humans were too weak to stop them, and the Concord would complain, but ultimately do nothing, because they never did anything. The attack came without warning. There was no declaration of war. There was no ultimatum. There was no final message giving humanity a chance to surrender or negotiate. The Vreth did not believe in giving prey a chance to run. 17 Vreth Dominion warships entered the solar system from 3 separate approach vectors simultaneously, a tactic designed to overwhelm any defensive response by splitting attention in multiple directions. Earth's early warning systems detected them less than 4 hours before they reached orbital range. 4 hours was not enough time to scramble a meaningful defense. It was barely enough time to sound the alarms. At 6:42 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time, the first orbital bombardment began. The Vreth did not use their most powerful weapons. They did not need to. What they used were standard mass driver platforms, enormous railgun systems mounted on their warships that could fire dense metallic projectiles from orbit at speeds that turned them into devastating kinetic weapons. Each projectile hit the ground with the force of a small nuclear bomb, but without the radiation. Clean destruction by Vreth standards. Efficient. The first strikes hit simultaneously across 7 continents. Mumbai, gone in 4 minutes. Sao Paulo, reduced to rubble in 6. Lagos, Shanghai, Cairo, Los Angeles, London, Moscow. The strikes came in waves, precise and methodical, targeting population centers and military installations in the same breath. The Vreth had studied humanity's infrastructure for years. They knew where the power grids were, where the military commands were based, where the largest concentrations of people lived. They hit all of it. The screaming on Earth's communication networks lasted for hours, before whole sections of it simply went dark. Governments tried to coordinate responses. Military commands tried to get their aircraft and missiles in the air. A few brave pilots flew directly at the Vreth ships in the only spacecraft Earth had available. Short-range defense vessels that were never designed for this kind of fight. They were destroyed quickly, but not without leaving marks. Several Vreth ships took minor damage. The Vreth noted this with mild interest and continued their bombardment. The Galactic Concorde detected the attack within the first hour. In the great political chambers on the Concorde's central station, a massive artificial structure the size of a small moon, located in neutral space between several major systems, delegates from dozens of species watched the live data feeds from Earth's solar system. Some watched with shock. Some watched with carefully hidden relief that it was not their world. Some watched with the blank, calculating expression of species that had seen this kind of thing before and had learned not to get involved. The Vreth ambassador to the Concorde, a large reptile named Draxus, sat in his chair, with his scaled hands folded calmly in his lap. He did not look concerned. One of the smaller species delegates, a round blue-furred creature from a world called Minne, leaned toward the Draxus and asked quietly if the Dominion planned to stop. Draxus looked at him the way a large animal looks at something small and harmless. "When we are finished," he said, "we will stop." The Concorde issued a formal statement 9 hours into the bombardment. It used careful diplomatic language. It expressed deep concern about the situation. It called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. It requested that all parties seek a peaceful resolution. It was the kind of statement that meant almost nothing, and everyone reading it knew that it meant almost nothing. The Vreth Dominion received it, logged it, and continued firing. For 72 hours, the bombardment continued. Not every city was destroyed. The Vreth were thorough, but not unlimited. They had 17 ships, not 1,000, and the solar system was large. But they hit hard, and they hit precisely. And when the firing finally stopped, the damage was almost impossible to describe. 2.3 billion people were dead. The number was so large that the human mind struggled to hold it. It was larger than the population of most continents. It was more deaths than any war in human history had ever produced. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were gone. Coastlines had changed shape from the force of the impacts. Fires burned across regions so large they could be seen from orbit. And yet, Earth did not go silent. This was the first thing that surprised the Vreth. They had expected panic. They had expected collapse. They had modeled the human response based on their historical knowledge of how primitive species reacted to overwhelming force. A period of chaos, then fragmentation, then the gradual submission of the surviving population centers as they realized resistance was pointless. None of that happened. The surviving humans did not fall apart. They did not turn on each other. There was grief, enormous, crushing, planet-wide grief. But underneath the grief, there was something else. Something the Vreth had not modeled correctly, because they did not fully understand what they were dealing with. There was anger. Not the hot, screaming kind of anger that burns out quickly. This was something colder. Something that moved through the surviving population like water, moving into cracks in stone. Quiet, patient, and absolutely relentless. People who had lost everything sat in the rubble of their cities and did not beg. They did not cry to the sky asking why. They looked at each other, and they understood something without saying it out loud. This was not over. In a hardened underground facility, beneath what remained of Geneva, Switzerland, the last functional body of the United Earth Council assembled. They came from every surviving nation. Some arrived in military transport vehicles. Some were patched in through emergency communication systems from other parts of the world. Many of them had lost family members in the attacks. All of them looked like people who had not slept in days, because none of them had. The session lasted 4 hours. There were no long debates. There were no factions arguing for different approaches. There was only one question on the table, and it was a simple question. What do we do now? Every single delegate voted the same way. The resolution they passed was called the Total War Authorization. It had been written years before, a legal document that had sat in sealed files, prepared by a small group of military planners and legal scholars who had quietly and without much fanfare spent the previous century thinking about exactly this kind of scenario. The document gave the United Earth Military Command unlimited authority to mobilize every resource on the planet for a single purpose. It removed all the normal political limits on military spending, weapons development, and strategic decision-making. It unified every surviving national military under one command structure. It was essentially humanity deciding to become a different kind of civilization overnight. Before the session ended, the Council authorized one outgoing transmission. It was broadcast on every frequency humanity used, including the ones that the Galactic Concord monitored. It was short. It did not contain threats or demands or emotional language. It said, "We are still here. We remember everything." The Vreth received the transmission on their flagship. Ambassador Draxus, watching from the Concord station, heard it and made a short sound that passed for laughter among his species. "Sentimental," he said to no one in particular. In the Concord chambers, several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few of the older ones, species who had been around long enough to have collected deep library of historical experience, exchanged looks with each other. They had seen conquered species send final transmissions before. Usually, those transmissions were filled with despair or pleading. This one did not sound like either. One old delegate, a tall, thin creature from a species called the Aran, who had lived for nearly 400 years, sat very still and read the transmission again on his personal screen. "We are still here. We remember everything." He read it a third time. Then he did something none of his colleagues noticed. He quietly pulled up everything he could find on human history. Their wars, their recoveries, their repeated pattern of falling to catastrophic lows, and then rising back with a ferocity that shocked even themselves. He read for a long time. When he finally closed his screen, his expression was not the calm, detached look he usually wore in these chambers. It was worry. Back on Earth, in the ruins of cities, and in the towns and villages that still stood, people were already moving, not fleeing, moving with purpose. Military officers were reorganizing surviving units. Scientists and engineers were being contacted by government representatives and asked to report to secure locations. Supply lines were being rerouted. Hidden facilities that most ordinary people didn't know existed, were being activated. The grief was real, and it was enormous. People wept for what had been lost. They held the names of the dead close. In the first weeks after the attack, there were days where the weight of it seemed like it would crush everything that remained. But it did not crush them. It made them harder. In a small town in northern Canada that had been largely untouched by the bombardment, a teenage girl sat on the roof of her house and looked up at the night sky. She had never paid much attention to the stars before. They had always just been there, beautiful but distant, something to look at on a clear night, without thinking too much about what they meant. Now she looked at them differently. She was thinking about the fact that somewhere out there, in that enormous darkness, something had decided that her world didn't matter. That the people she had known, the city she had heard about, the billions of lives that had existed just days ago, that none of it was worth anything. That humanity was just a resource waiting to be taken. She was 16 years old, and she was already thinking about what she was going to do when she was old enough to do something about it. She was not alone in this. Across the planet, in the wreckage, and in the places that still stood, a generation was being born, not of bodies, but of purpose. A generation that would grow up knowing exactly what the galaxy had done, knowing exactly what had been taken, and knowing, with the deep and patient certainty that humans carry when they have truly made up their minds, that the accounting for it had not yet begun. The Vreth Dominion celebrated quietly. Their high command filed the operation as a success, and moved on to planning the next phase. The formal resource extraction from the human solar system, the establishment of orbital control platforms, the slow process of turning a conquered system into a productive part of the Dominion. They were already thinking about what came next. They had stopped thinking about humanity. That was their mistake, the greatest mistake they would ever make. Somewhere in the cold dark between stars, the gears of something enormous and patient, and deeply, terribly human, had already begun to turn. The galaxy did not know it yet, but it would. The world that existed after the bombardment was not the same world that had existed before it. This sounds like an obvious thing to say. Of course, a world that loses 2.3 billion people in 72 hours is not the same world. Of course, everything changes after something like that. But the change that happened to Earth in the months following the Vreth attack was not just the change of loss and grief, though there was plenty of both. The change was something deeper, something in the way humanity saw itself, the way it organized itself, and the way it thought about the future. Before the attack, Earth had been many things at once. It had been many countries with many governments, many languages, many ideas about how people should live and who should have power. It had been a world that argued with itself constantly, that fought over borders and resources and beliefs, that had solved some of its oldest problems and stubbornly refused to solve others. It was messy and complicated and very human. After the attack, it was still all of those things, but it was also, for the first time in its history, completely unified in one single direction. The Total War Authorization did something that centuries of diplomacy and international cooperation had never managed to do. It put every surviving government, every surviving military, every surviving industrial and scientific body under one roof. Not because people suddenly agreed on everything, they didn't. Not because the old differences disappeared, they didn't disappear either. But because every human being alive understood, in the most direct and personal way possible, that the alternative to unity was extinction. And humans, when faced with extinction, do not give up. They adapt. The first thing the new unified command did was go quiet. This was deliberate, and it was the smartest thing they could have done. Every outgoing signal from Earth that was not essential was cut off. Trade communications with the few alien species humanity had commercial relationships with were suspended. The small number of human diplomatic personnel stationed at the Galactic Concord were recalled. Quietly and without announcement, Earth pulled back from galactic politics the way a person pulls their hand back from a hot surface. Fast, complete, and with no intention of explaining why. The Galactic Concord noticed, of course. The sudden silence from Earth was unusual enough that it generated some discussion in the chambers. But the general opinion among the major species was that humanity was doing what most conquered or damaged civilizations did, retreating inward to deal with the trauma, probably beginning the slow process of fragmenting into smaller groups, as the pressure of survival overcame the shock of unity. The Vreth Dominion sent scouts to the edges of the solar system 3 months after the attack. Standard procedure. They wanted to begin preliminary surveys for their resource extraction operation. The scouts reported nothing unusual. Earth's orbit had some debris from the bombardment. The planet's surface showed the expected damage patterns. There was no unusual military activity visible from long range. The human defense fleet, such as it was, appeared to have gone into hiding or simply fallen apart. Ambassador Draxus received this report and felt satisfied. He filed the human system as pacified, pending extraction phase, and moved on to other business. He had no idea what was happening on the dark side of the moon. In the century before the Vrath attack, during the long decades when humanity was slowly learning that the galaxy was not a friendly place, and that their repeated applications to the galactic concord were going nowhere, a small group of military planners, scientists, and strategists had quietly put together a program that was known to very few people outside of its own circle. They called it Protocol Lazarus. The name came from an old human story about a man who came back from the dead. The people who designed the program thought that was an appropriate name. Their entire purpose was to make sure that if someone tried to kill humanity, humanity would come back. They had spent 100 years preparing for exactly what the Vareth had done. The program had 3 components. The first was information, protocol. Lazarus had spent decades collecting and analyzing every piece of data it could gather about alien military technology, tactics, weaknesses, political structures, and supply chains. Human intelligence operatives, people who had spent years living and working in alien space, some of them deep inside Concord institutions, had been feeding information back for decades. By the time the Vreth attacked, Protocol Lazarus had more detailed knowledge about the internal workings of the Vreth Dominion's military than most Vreth generals had themselves. The second component was technology. Deep in facilities built inside asteroids, under the ocean floors, and inside hollow mountains, human engineers and scientists had been quietly developing weapons and systems that they never showed to anyone, not to the Concord, not to alien trading partners, not to the public. These were projects that operated outside the normal channels of human government, funded through accounts buried so deep in budget systems that almost nobody knew they existed. The work these people had done over a century was extraordinary. They had studied every known alien propulsion system and built something better. They had taken the principles of quantum physics further than any alien civilization had bothered to go, partly because those alien civilizations had not needed to. They had not had the motivation that comes from knowing you are the weakest species in a very dangerous galaxy. They had developed materials that could absorb and redistribute energy in ways that made conventional weapons dramatically less effective against them. They had built artificial intelligence systems for combat coordination that could process battlefield data faster than any organic brain. They had also built ships, not the small, short-range defense vessels that Earth's regular military used. Real ships, big ones, ships that could travel between stars, that could fight and survive, and keep fighting. They had been building them slowly, over many years, in locations that were not visible to any alien scanner. The dark side of the moon held 3 of the largest construction facilities. Asteroids in the outer belt had been quietly hollowed out to serve as factories and depots. The third component of Protocol Lazarus was the plan itself, a detailed, constantly updated strategic document that laid out exactly what humanity would do if an alien power attacked Earth without warning. It covered everything: the political steps, the military steps, the communication strategy, the target priorities. It had been revised and improved by generations of planners, each one adding to the work of the ones who came before. When the total war authorization was passed in Geneva, Protocol Lazarus activated automatically. The facilities that had been silent for years came to life. Workers and engineers who had been living normal lives, waiting for a call they hoped would never come, received their activation codes and left their homes. Production that had been running at a slow, careful pace to avoid detection suddenly ran at full capacity. Every ship that had been built was brought out of its hidden dock and fitted with the final weapon systems that had been kept separate until they were needed. Took 11 months. 11 months during which Earth appeared to the outside galaxy to be a quiet, damaged, slowly dying civilization. During those 11 months, the Vreth Dominion grew more comfortable. Their extraction teams were being prepared. Their legal teams were drafting the documents that would formally claim the human solar system as Vareth territory under Concord law, a process that was somewhat complicated by the fact that the Concord had not formally approved the attack, but complicated only in a bureaucratic sense, not in any way that actually threatened the Dominion's plans. At the Concord station, Ambassador Draxus had begun attending social functions again after a brief period of slightly uncomfortable scrutiny following the attack. The discomfort had passed. Nobody in the Concord was willing to move against the Vreth Dominion over a species that didn't even have full membership. The politics were too messy. The cost was too high. And honestly, most of the major species had their own relationships with the Vreth that they didn't want to damage. 3 months before the end of the 11 months, Draxus sent a transmission to Earth. It was a short message sent on the standard communication frequency that humanity used. The tone was casual, almost bored. He said that the Dominion was prepared to begin the formal transfer of the solar system's resource rights, and that any surviving human leadership was welcome to participate in the documentation process if they wished to have any kind of official record of the transfer. He noted that cooperation would be viewed favorably, and that humans who assisted with the process would be treated well. He signed off with a phrase that translated roughly from Vreth as, "Have they finally accepted death?" It was intended to be insulting. It was certainly understood that way by the human communications officers who received it. The transmission was logged. It was not answered. The weeks passed. In the final weeks of the 11-month preparation period, a woman named Seraphine Okafor sat in a small, plain office deep inside a military facility that had no official name on any public document. She was 53 years old with short gray hair and dark brown eyes that had the particular quality of someone who spends a great deal of time thinking about things that are very heavy. She had been in the military for 30 years. She had risen through the ranks not because she was the loudest or the most aggressive officer in any room, but because she was, by any measure, the most precise. She thought in systems. She saw how things connected. She was almost never wrong. She had been appointed by the Unified Military Command as the flag officer for what was being called, in the documents that very few people had access to, Operation Consequence. She was going to lead the fleet. On the day the fleet was formally assembled and ready, she walked through the hangar bay of the lead construction facility on the lunar surface and looked at what humanity had built. It took her a long time to walk from one end of the bay to the other. The ships were enormous, each one bearing on its hull the name of a city that no longer existed. Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Lagos, Cairo, Shanghai, and dozens more. Every ship carried a name, and every name carried weight. The fleet consisted of 1,400 warships. Admiral Okafor walked through the bay without speaking. Her staff walked behind her, quiet, watching her face for any reaction. There was a feeling in that hangar that was hard to describe. It was not excitement, exactly, though there was some of that. It was not grief, exactly, though there was a great deal of that too. It was something that existed in the space between those two things. A feeling of absolute, settled, unshakable resolve. When she reached the end of the bay, she turned and looked back at the fleet she was about to take into battle. She stood there for a long moment. Then she said 2 words to her chief of staff: "Prepare departure." The fleet moved into position. 1,400 ships running in formation, in the dark side of the moon's shadow, invisible to any scanner pointed at them from outside the solar system. Final checks were run. Final briefings were held. Final messages were sent by soldiers and officers to family members back on Earth. Quiet personal messages that people write when they are about to do something that they may not come back from. There was no ceremony. There was no speech broadcast to the planet. The departure was as quiet as everything else had been in the past 11 months. The fleet slipped out of the solar system the way a blade slips out of a sheath, smoothly, quickly, and with complete purpose. And then, using a propulsion system that no alien civilization knew humanity possessed, they jumped. Not the slow, curved path travel that most interstellar species used. Something faster. Something that the quantum physicists buried in Protocol Lazarus facilities had spent 60 years figuring out. A faceslip. A fold in the travel path that cut the distance between 2 points in space to a fraction of what it should have been. They were gone before any external scanner could have registered their departure. On the Concord station, Ambassador Draxus was attending a formal dinner hosted by a wealthy trading species from the Central Systems. He was eating well and talking about economic projections for the newly acquired human solar system. He seemed relaxed. He had no idea that 1,400 warships were moving through the dark between stars, at a speed his civilization's best engineers would have called impossible. He had no idea that every one of those ships was crewed by people who had grown up with the names of the dead built into the walls of their world. He had no idea that the long, quiet 11 months were over. He would find out soon. They all would. The Vreth home system had never been attacked. Not once in 300 years of the Dominion's existence. Not once in all the wars and expansions and political conflicts that had shaped the eastern part of the galaxy. The Vreth system was considered by everyone who thought about it to be untouchable. Not just because the Dominion was powerful, though it was. Not just because their defenses were strong, though they were. But because no species had ever been foolish enough, or desperate enough, or capable enough to try. It had 3 inhabited planets. The largest, Vreth Prime, was the capital. A dry, hot world of deep red rock and enormous cities that had been built over centuries into the cliffs and canyons that cut through the surface like great scars. The second planet, Vreth Secundus, was a military world, largely covered in training facilities, weapons factories, and naval bases. The third, a cooler planet called Vreth Minor, held the civilian populations that had been relocated there during previous expansions, along with the agricultural systems that fed much of the inner Dominion. Around all 3 planets, the Vreth had built their defensive network over the course of a century. It was impressive by any measure. 47 orbital battle stations formed a ring around Vreth Prime, each one large enough to hold several hundred crew members, and armed with weapons capable of destroying a ship at extreme range. These stations communicated constantly with each other, forming an overlapping field of sensor coverage that was designed to detect any incoming object large enough to be a threat. Around Vreth Secundus, the naval yards held the main Vreth war fleet, over 600 warships in various states of readiness, from fully armed and crewed vessels to those in repair. Patrol fleets moved constantly through the system in rotating schedules, watching every approach vector. The Vreth had designed this system for one purpose: to make their home system impenetrable. They had done a very good job against any opponent who approached the way a conventional interstellar force approaches, traveling at standard speeds along predictable paths, showing up on sensors days or hours before arrival, giving the defensive network time to prepare. The system would have held. The human fleet did not approach that way. The face-slip drive that Protocol Lazarus scientists had developed did not just make travel faster in a general sense. At its full capability, it allowed a ship to effectively vanish from normal space along its travel path and reappear at the destination point almost instantly from the perspective of anyone watching from the outside. A ship using the face-slip drive did not cross the space between 2 points. It stepped over it, the way a person steps over a crack in the ground, rather than walking around it. The Vreth detection systems were looking for things moving through space. They were not looking for things that appeared in space. At 0300 hours Vreth home system time, on a night when the primary duty shifts, on most of the battle stations had just ended their briefings, and the secondary shifts were settling in, 1,400 human warships dropped out of face-slips simultaneously, not at the edge of the system, inside the defensive perimeter, between the orbital stations and the planets. The Vreth sensors registered the arrival in the same half-second that every alarm in the system went off at once. 1,400 contacts appearing from nothing, filling the tactical displays with so many signals that the automated threat assessment systems temporarily crashed, trying to process the sheer number of them. In the 60 seconds it took for the Vreth commanders on the battle stations to override the crashed systems and get working displays back, the human fleet had already spread into its operational formation. Admiral Okafor's voice was completely calm when she opened the fleet-wide channel. All ships, confirm formation, begin operational sequence. No deviation from targeting priorities. On the bridge of the flagship, the UES Hiroshima, a ship named for a city that had been destroyed by an atomic bomb nearly 300 years ago and rebuilt and destroyed again by the Vreth bombardment, and now carried as a name on the hull of humanity's most powerful warship. Her tactical officers called out position confirmations from across the fleet. Every ship was where it needed to be. Okafor opened a second channel, not to the fleet, to the Vreth system. This is Admiral Serafina Okafor of the United Earth Terran Fleet. This message is being transmitted to all Vreth military and civilian receivers in this system. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to accept terms. What happens in this system today is a direct consequence of what your government chose to do to ours. Civilians who move away from military assets and installations will not be targeted. Military assets will be destroyed. That is the only message I have for you. She closed the channel. Then she looked at her weapons officer and gave the order to begin. The first 60 seconds of the battle were, from the Wraith perspective, simply chaos. They were used to battles where both sides have approached, where there was time to form up, to receive orders, to run through standard engagement protocols. Their commanders were trained in a warfare doctrine that assumed a certain amount of lead time, time to see the enemy coming, time to prepare the response, time to coordinate. None of that existed here. The human weapons struck first and struck everywhere at once. Each of the 1,400 ships had been assigned a specific target list before the fleet jumped. The targeting priorities had been prepared by Protocol Lazarus analysts over years of studying the Wraith defensive network. Which systems were connected, which ones, if destroyed, would create cascading failures in others, which ones needed to be taken out first to reduce the fleet's exposure during the later phases of the operation. The orbital battle stations were the priority. 47 stations. The human fleet hit them in a precisely sequenced pattern, designed to prevent any station from repositioning or reinforcing another before it was struck. Long-range torpedo systems fired first, weapons guided by the decentralized AI coordination system that Protocol Lazarus engineers called the Swarm. Unlike conventional guided weapons, which were controlled by a central command and therefore vulnerable to jamming or the destruction of that central command, the Swarm system had no center. Every weapon communicated with every other weapon, collectively adjusting their paths in real time, too fast for any defensive system to track all of them at once. The Wraith Point defense systems on the battle stations, designed to shoot down incoming missiles and torpedoes, worked well against conventional weapons. They were good systems. Under normal circumstances, they could handle significant incoming fire. They were not designed to handle 800 simultaneous inbound targets that were constantly communicating with each other and adjusting their approach angles faster than any targeting computer could predict. 13 battle stations were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. The Vreth Navy at Vreth Secundus was moving by then. Whatever confusion and shock the initial appearance of the fleet had caused, the Vreth were experienced warriors, and experienced warriors recover from shock faster than most. The alarm protocols were designed to get ships moving, even before full information was available, and within 5 minutes of the fleet's arrival, the Vreth Naval Yard was launching everything it had. What came out of those yards was a lot. Over 400 active warships pushed toward the human fleet, forming up as they moved. The Vreth commanders were shouting orders across their own communication networks, trying to put together a formation that could punch through the human lines and give them enough room to use their longest-range weapons effectively. It was a reasonable approach. Against a normal enemy, it might have worked. The human shield systems had been built on a principle the Vreth had never encountered. Most species built shields by projecting energy fields that absorbed or deflected incoming fire. The human ships did something different. Their hull materials, developed over 60 years in facilities that nobody outside Protocol Lazarus had ever seen, were designed to absorb energy and redistribute it across the entire hull surface, converting the force of impact into heat that was then radiated away. The effect was that weapons which should have punched through and caused catastrophic damage instead spread their energy across a large area and caused only surface heating. It was not perfect protection. Enough sustained fire in one place would eventually overwhelm the redistribution system, but it meant that a Wraith weapon that would have destroyed a normal ship in 1 or 2 direct hits needed 10 or 15 hits in the same spot before it posed a serious threat. The Wraith realized this very quickly, and they realized something else almost as quickly. The human ships did not fight the way any species in the Galactic Concord fought. Every species in the Concord had fighting doctrines built on the assumption that command and control meant a hierarchy. Officers giving orders down a chain, lower-ranked crew executing those orders. It was logical. It was organized. But it also meant that if you disrupted the command structure, if you took out the flagship, killed the admiral, jammed the communication systems, The fighting effectiveness of the fleet dropped dramatically. The human fleet had no single point of failure. Every captain had full operational authority for their ship and their assigned task group. Every ship's AI could communicate directly with every other ship's AI. Decisions that in a Wraith fleet would require 6 levels of command approval happened on human ships in seconds, adjusted in real time to what was actually happening in the battle, rather than what the plan had assumed would happen. The result was a fleet that seemed to flow like water. When the Wraith pushed in one direction, the human formation didn't try to hold. It bent, redirected, and struck the Wraith ships from angles that the push had exposed. When a human ship took heavy damage and needed to pull back, 3 other ships smoothly filled the gap without any visible order being given. It was deeply unsettling to fight. Admiral Okafor moved through the battle with the calm of someone who had run the scenario in simulations more times than she could count. She watched the tactical display, listened to the position reports, and gave adjustments when they were needed. Her bridge crew worked quietly and efficiently. There was no drama on the Hiroshima's bridge, just work. 2 hours into the battle, the Vreth launched their dreadnoughts. These were the largest ships in the Dominion's navy. 6 vessels, each one nearly twice the size of anything the human fleet had. They had been held back initially, positioned at the far edge of the system as a reserve. The Vreth commanders had decided that the human fleet, despite its unexpected appearance and surprising early effectiveness, would be unable to stand against the dreadnoughts. Nothing in the eastern part of the galaxy could stand against them. The 6 dreadnoughts came in fast, firing at long range as they approached. Their weapons were powerful enough that even with the human hull redistribution systems, several ships in the path of their fire took serious damage. 2 human vessels had to pull back out of the line entirely. One, hit by multiple dreadnought shots in rapid succession in the same section of hull, broke apart. Okafor watched this on her display. She did not change her expression. She opened a channel to the 3 task groups that had been designated for exactly this scenario. Execute hammer response. All 3 groups converge now. 350 ships that had been holding positions on the far flanks of the battle formation turned and accelerated toward the dreadnoughts from 3 different directions simultaneously. Each group was carrying the heaviest weapons in the fleet. Not the swarm torpedoes, but direct fire systems, high-energy beam weapons that Protocol Lazarus engineers had based on principles found in alien technology and then built larger, more powerful versions of. The dreadnoughts, designed to fight enemies who came at them from the front, found themselves caught between 3 converging forces. They tried to turn. The turning time for ships that large was significant. The human task groups did not give them that time. The battle around the dreadnoughts lasted 19 minutes. When it ended, 4 of the 6 were destroyed, and the remaining 2 were drifting without propulsion, sending emergency signals. 38 hours after the fleet's arrival in the system, every Vreth orbital platform around Vreth Prime was gone. The naval yard at Vreth Secundus was destroyed. The remaining Vreth warships, those that had survived and were still fighting, were being pressed back toward Vreth Minor, running out of room. From the surface of Vreth Prime, in the great canyon city that served as the Empire's capital, the Vreth Emperor sat in a chamber deep underground and watched the feeds from his surviving military assets. The reports were all the same. His commanders were not asking for permission to counterattack. They were asking for permission to withdraw. Some were just withdrawing. He had never in 30 years of ruling the Dominion experienced this feeling. He did not have a name for it. His species did not use this feeling often enough to have developed a common word for it. But it was the feeling of being completely, helplessly outmatched. Not by luck, not by numbers, not by some temporary advantage that would go away when conditions changed. Outmatched by something fundamental. Something that had been built over a very long time, carefully and deliberately, specifically for this purpose. He broadcast a ceasefire request on the emergency frequency. On the bridge of the Hiroshima, a communications officer turned to Admiral Okafor and reported that the Vreth Emperor was requesting an immediate ceasefire and opening terms for negotiation. Okafor did not stop looking at her tactical display. "Log the transmission," she said. "Mark the time. Include the note that it was received and reviewed." The officer paused. "Admiral, are we accepting the ceasefire?" Okafor's eyes did not move from the display. "Fleet continue," she said quietly into the open channel. The communications officer logged the transmission. He marked the time. He included the note. The fleet continued. Across the galaxy, on the Concord station, and on dozens of homeworlds, alien governments and military commands were watching the battle data coming in from their intelligence assets in the Vareth system. The data was being transmitted in near real time, and what they were seeing had stopped conversations in their tracks. Briefings had been interrupted. Dinner tables had been left. Generals and admirals and politicians were standing in front of screens with expressions that ranged from shock to something closer to genuine fear. This was not what humanity was supposed to be capable of. This was not what anyone had modeled, predicted, or imagined. A Vreth dominion that had 300 years of military experience, a massive navy, a heavily defended home system, and a reputation for being one of the most powerful military forces in the known galaxy, was being dismantled, methodically, precisely, without anger, without chaos, without even the appearance of difficulty. Several alien governments quietly began pulling up their own histories of interactions with humanity. They began reviewing how they had voted on Earth's Concord membership applications. They began reviewing what they had said about humans in diplomatic channels. More than a few of them were very grateful in that moment that they had never done anything to directly provoke the species they were watching on those screens. The old Aaron delegate, who had been worried back in the chambers on the day of the attack, sat alone in his private quarters and watched the battle feed with his long, thin hands folded in his lap. He was not surprised. He had done his research. He had known in the way that very old beings with very long memories know things, that this outcome was possible, that humanity was not what the galaxy had assumed it was, that the silence of the past 11 months had not been the silence of defeat. It had been the silence of preparation. He watched the Vreth system burn, and he thought about the transmission Earth had sent on the third day of the bombardment. We are still here. We remember everything. He understood now, in a way he had not fully understood even then, what that message had actually meant. It had not been a statement of survival. It had been a promise. When the firing finally stopped, the Vreth system was quiet, in a way it had never been before. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful. A room where something terrible has just happened is quiet. A street after an accident is quiet. The Vreth system was quiet the way all those things are quiet, with the weight of what had just occurred, pressing, making even the normal sounds of machinery and systems and living things seem small and distant. The orbital platforms were gone. The pieces of them drifted in slow, wide arcs around Vreth Prime, catching what little light reached this deep into the system. The naval yards at Vreth Secundus were dark and broken. Ships that had been fighting hours ago now drifted with no power, their emergency beacons sending small, steady pulses into the dark. The interstellar equivalent of a raised saying, "We are here. We are no longer a threat. Please do not destroy us." Admiral Okafor's fleet held its position in the space between the planets. They had not advanced on the planetary surfaces. This was not an accident or a limitation. It was a decision. The targeting priorities of Operation Consequence had been very clear from the beginning. Military infrastructure, naval assets, orbital weapons platforms, everything that made the Vreth Dominion capable of projecting force against other civilizations. Those were the targets. The cities on Vreth Prime, the civilian settlements on Vreth Minor, the agricultural regions, and the schools, and the hospitals, and the millions of ordinary Vreth who had not decided to bomb Earth. Those were not targets. This distinction was the thing that confused the galaxy most in the days that followed. A species that had just lost 2.3 billion people had sent a fleet across the galaxy, destroyed the most powerful military force in the Eastern Quadrant, and then stopped. They did not push their advantage onto the surface. They did not demand unconditional surrender in the way that historically conquered species had sometimes been forced to grovel. They did not take anything. They just stopped. And then Admiral Okafor opened a broadcast channel to the Vreth system and spoke to the people of the Dominion directly. "People of the Vreth Dominion," she said. Her voice was even, the way a teacher's voice is even. Not cold, exactly, but carrying an authority that did not need to be raised to be felt. "Your government chose to attack our world without warning or provocation. Your government chose to kill 2.3 billion people. Your military has been destroyed as a direct consequence of that choice. We have not targeted your civilian population. We will not target your civilian population. The loss of life on your world today, though unavoidable in the prosecution of this operation, was not our goal." She paused for a moment. "Rebuild. Build a government that does not point weapons at civilizations that have done nothing to you. Build a society that your children can live in without it being held up by the suffering of others. If you do those things, we will never return. If you do not, if a new Vreth Dominion emerges that chooses the same path as the one we have just ended, you now know what the consequence of that choice looks like. We are not asking for a reply. We have nothing further to say." She closed the channel. The transmission went out across the Vreth system. It reached the deep underground chamber, where the Emperor sat, surrounded by the few advisors who had not yet fled. It was played in shocked silence, in hospitals and civilian shelters, where Vreth families had gathered to wait out the battle. It was received by every surviving military installation, most of which had already stopped functioning. The Emperor listened to the entire thing without moving. When it finished, he sat for a long time in silence. He had expected threats. He had expected demands. He had expected to be required to prostrate his empire before these humans in a formal ceremony of submission, the kind of thing the Dominion had required of species it conquered. That would have been humiliating, but understandable. It was the grammar of power that the Dominion understood. This was not that. This was something he had no framework for. He was being told that the humans had already gotten what they came for, and they were leaving. He was being told that the choice about what the Dominion became next was his. He was being given, after everything that had happened, a kind of terrible freedom. He did not know what to do with it. In the Galactic Concord emergency session that convened 36 hours after the battle ended, the chambers were louder than they had been in decades. Delegates from species across the Concord were arguing, questioning, accusing. The Vreth delegation was present, but silent. They had received instructions from Vreth Prime to say nothing and offer nothing until the extent of the situation was more clear. Most of the noise in the chamber was coming from species reacting to the fact that a conflict of this scale had happened inside Concord-adjacent space without anyone stopping it. But underneath all the noise was a very specific kind of fear, because the battle had not been the most frightening thing to come out of the past 24 hours. The most frightening thing had come 4 hours after the battle ended, when the Concord's Internal Investigation Office released a preliminary report based on evidence that had been delivered to the Concord by an anonymous source. The report was short. It listed, with specific details and supporting documentation, the names of 7 Concord member species that secretly assisted the Vreth Dominion in the planning of the attack on Earth. The assistance had taken different forms. One species had provided detailed orbital survey data of Earth that the Vreth had used to plan the bombardment targeting. 2 others had voted at specific moments in the Concord political process to delay responses and keep humanity's membership application permanently tabled, not out of honest political disagreement, but because they had been offered economic concessions by the Vreth Dominion in exchange for doing so. One had passed along intelligence about Earth's military capacity, intelligence that had helped the Vreth conclude that humanity could not defend itself effectively. 7 species named, documented, exposed. The chamber went from loud to very quiet, very fast. Everyone in that room understood what the report meant, because everyone in that room understood where the report had come from. It had not come from the Vreth. It had not come from a neutral investigation. It had come from human intelligence networks, networks that, it was now extremely clear, had been operating inside the Concord itself for years, possibly decades. How deep did those networks go? How much did the humans know? How many conversations in how many chambers had been observed? How many private diplomatic communications had been intercepted? Nobody knew the answer to those questions. And the fact that nobody knew was, if anything, more frightening than any specific answer would have been. Ambassador Draxus was still at the Concord station when the report was released. He had been trying, since the battle began, to maintain the appearance of calm. It had become increasingly difficult. When the report was made public, and his screen filled with the details of 7 named collaborators, he finally abandoned any attempt to look composed. He sat very still in his chair, Around him, the delegates of the named species were already on their personal communication systems, some of them clearly trying to reach their governments, some of them just sitting in the particular frozen stillness of people who have just watched everything fall apart and have not yet processed what to do next. One of the smaller neutral species delegates leaned toward his counterpart and said, in a very low voice, that he was beginning to think the humans had known what was going to happen before it happened. His counterpart, a careful and experienced diplomat who had spent 40 years learning not to say things that could be used against her, said nothing. But her silence said enough. The old Aaron delegate watched all of this from his seat with the same quiet, steady expression he had worn through everything. He watched the accused delegates. He watched the nervous species who were not accused, but who were clearly wondering if they should be. He watched Ambassador Draxus, whose controlled exterior had finally cracked enough to show the fear underneath it. And he thought about something that one of his species' oldest philosophers had written centuries ago about the nature of power. The philosopher had argued that the most complete form of power was not the ability to destroy your enemy. It was the ability to make your enemy uncertain about what you knew, what you were capable of, and what you intended to do next. The philosopher had called it the power of the unknown quantity. Humanity, the old delegate thought, had just demonstrated that principle in the most thorough way possible. The galaxy did not know the full extent of what humans knew. It did not know the full extent of what humans could do. It did not know what other capabilities existed that had not yet been shown. And it did not know, and this was perhaps the most important thing, what humanity intended to do next. That uncertainty was worth more than any number of warships. Back on Earth, the news of the battle's outcome reached a population that was still deep in the process of grieving and rebuilding. The cities were still ruined. The memorials were still being built. There were still bodies being found in the rubble of places that had been struck hard, and then been buried under the chaos of everything that followed. The reaction to the victory was not celebration in any simple sense. There were people who felt relief, and people who felt a complicated mixture of grief and something that might have been pride. There were people who had lost everyone they loved and felt nothing at all, just a kind of numbness that had settled in months ago and had not yet lifted. There were people who thought it had been necessary, and people who thought it had been too much, and people who could not decide between those two things, and stayed up late into the night thinking about it. But there was one thing that almost everyone agreed on. The United Earth Council passed a resolution that authorized what was perhaps the most significant act of the entire period following the attack. They ordered a continuous broadcast transmitted on every frequency in every direction to every corner of the galaxy that human signals could reach. The broadcast was a reading of names, 2.3 billion names, every person who had died in the bombardment, their names spoken aloud in the languages of the countries and communities they had come from, read by volunteers from around the world who took turns at the microphone for hours at a time. The broadcast ran without interruption, took 9 days, no political statements, no victory declarations, no commentary, just the names spoken carefully and clearly, one after another, without end, until every single one of them had been said out loud into the universe. On the Concord station, the broadcast was received on the first day and was immediately a subject of conversation in the diplomatic community. Several species found it incomprehensible. Why spend 9 days reading names when the conflict was over? What was the point? It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It did not accomplish anything practical. But there were others who understood it very precisely. It was a message delivered not with weapons and not with politics, but with something that most of the species in the galaxy had forgotten or never learned to recognize. It was a statement about what humanity valued, about what they considered worth saying out loud, about the kind of civilization they intended to be, one that remembered its people not as a statistic, not as a number in a report, but as individuals with names that deserved to be spoken. It lasted 9 days. The galaxy listened, not all of it. Not every species sat by their receivers for 9 days, but the broadcast was there, steady and continuous, filling the space between stars with the names of the dead. And something about that, something about the scale of the grief and the patience of the remembering, made a very deep impression on the civilizations that received it. The old Aaron delegate sat in his quarters on the station and listened to it for a long time. He listened until he had to stop, not because he wanted to, but because something in his old chest was pressing too hard, and he needed to walk for a while before he could sit still again. He had been around a very long time. He had seen species rise and fall. He had seen wars begin and end. He had seen civilizations make terrible mistakes, and sometimes recover from them, and sometimes not. He had never, in 400 years, heard anything quite like this. 1 year after the Battle of Wrath Prime, the galaxy was a different place. Not different in ways you could always point to directly. The stars were in the same positions. The trade routes ran along the same paths. The Galactic Concord still met in its great chambers on the station in neutral space. Delegates from dozens of species still arguing about borders and resources and laws, and all the things that large political bodies argue about endlessly. On the surface, many things looked the same. But underneath all of that, something fundamental had shifted. The shift was not easy to put into a single sentence, though many diplomats and scholars and political analysts in the months that followed tried to do exactly that. What they kept coming back to, regardless of their species or their perspective, was this. Before the Battle of Wrath Prime, humanity was a footnote. After it, humanity was the question that every other civilization was quietly asking themselves about. The unknown factor that sat in every strategic calculation. The name that came up in conversations that had nothing to do with humanity at all, simply because it was now impossible to think about power and conflict and the structure of the galaxy without thinking about what Earth had done and what Earth might do next. The Galactic Concord made their offer 6 weeks after the battle. It was not a small offer. It was the most generous membership proposal the Concord had made to any new species in over a century. Full membership with all the rights that came with it. A permanent seat on the Security Council, one of the most powerful positions in the Concord structure. Veto power over decisions that directly affected humanity's solar system. Guaranteed protection under Concord law. The offer was read aloud in the chamber by the Concord Secretary General, a tall, four-armed being from a species called the Dulhuri, who was known for her careful, measured approach to everything, and it was received with the particular silence of a chamber full of beings who were not entirely sure how the response was going to come back. Earth's response came back 3 days later. It was delivered by a human diplomat named Marcus Webb, a quiet, precise man in his late 40s, who had spent 20 years working in Concord-adjacent institutions, and who had, apparently, been one of the intelligence operatives embedded in the Concord for years before the attack. He stood in the center of the chamber in front of every delegate from every major species, and he read the response from the United Earth Council without any visible emotion. Earth declined. The full response was longer than that, of course. Thanked the Concord for the offer. It acknowledged the gesture. It noted, in careful and specific language, that the offer should have come 40 years ago, when Earth had first applied, and that the fact that it was only coming now, after Earth had demonstrated military capacity, that the Concord could not ignore. Said everything that needed to be said about the nature of the offer and what it was actually based on. And then it said that humanity had decided to take a different path. The path was called the Terran Sovereign Pact. Over the previous year, while the galaxy had been processing the battle and the investigation reports and the 9-day broadcast, human diplomats had been doing something much quieter. They had been talking to the small species. The ones who had no seat on the Security Council and no veto power and no powerful allies. The ones who existed in the spaces between the major powers, too small to be important and too present to be ignored. The ones who had watched the Vreth Dominion bully and threaten and take and had no one to call for help. There were more of these species than most people in the Concord realized. When you only paid attention to the large and powerful, the small ones became invisible. The Vreth had understood this and had used it. Those small species made excellent victims because nobody would do anything when they were threatened. Humanity had spent a year talking to them. The Terran Sovereign Pact was not a military alliance in the traditional sense. It was not built on the model of the Concord with its endless committees and layers of bureaucracy and political compromises that took years to resolve. It was simpler. Its core was a single guarantee: Any species that signed the pact and was attacked without provocation would receive a response from the Terran fleet. Not a diplomatic response, not a strongly worded statement, a response. 12 species signed on the first day, 23 more signed within the month. The Galactic Concord watched this with a mixture of reactions. Some were openly hostile. The formation of an independent bloc outside Concord structures was a direct challenge to the Concord's authority, and everyone knew it. Some were quietly worried for more personal reasons, wondering whether the human intelligence networks that had already exposed 7 collaborators in the Vreth attack were still active, still watching, still building files. Some were simply calculating the new balance of power and trying to figure out where they stood in a galaxy that now included a human-led bloc whose military capabilities had just been demonstrated in the most direct way possible. A few, mostly the smaller species who had never been happy under Concord arrangements, were genuinely relieved. One species, the Menai, the small blue-furred beings whose delegate had sat near Ambassador Draxus on the day of the attack, had been quietly threatened by the Vreth Dominion for years. They had been paying a kind of informal economic tribute to keep Vreth ships out of their space, and had never told the Concord about it, because they knew the Concord would not do anything. When the pact was announced, the Mene delegate cried in the Concord chamber. Not quietly. She let it happen openly without trying to stop it. And several delegates who had known her for decades said they had never seen her do anything like that before. She was the first to sign. Admiral Okafor was called before the United Earth Council in the 3rd month after the battle. The hearing was not a celebration. There had been deliberate effort to keep it from becoming one. The Council had decided early on that treating Okafor as a hero in any formal sense would send a message they did not want to send. That Earth gloried in what had happened. That the destruction was something to be proud of, rather than something that had been necessary and terrible, and would carry weight for a long time. The hearing lasted 2 days. The Council members asked hard questions. About the refusal to accept the Vreth ceasefire. About the decision to continue the operation after a surrender offer had been made. About the number of Vreth military casualties, and whether all of them had truly been necessary. About the precise boundaries of what Operation Consequence had been authorized to do, and whether those boundaries had been respected. Okafor answered every question directly and without defensiveness. She explained each decision in terms of the strategic logic that had driven it. She did not apologize for what she had done, but she also did not make it sound easy, or clean, or without cost. She spoke about it the way a surgeon speaks about a difficult operation, with the precise language of someone who had made hard choices in a hard situation and was willing to account for every one of them. At the end of the 2nd day, the Council made its determination. She was not punished. She was not celebrated. She was thanked for her service and told that she would be retained in command of the Terran fleet. The determination was that Operation Consequence had been conducted within the bounds of its authorization, and that the decisions made during it, while weighty, had been made with appropriate consideration. But the Council also added something to the record that was not technically part of the determination. One of the older members, a woman from West Africa named Amara Diallo, who had been in the Council for over 30 years, and who was known for saying exactly what she thought, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it, added a note that she requested be included permanently in the official record of the hearing. The note said that what humanity had done at Vreth Prime had been necessary. It also said that necessity was not the same as goodness. That the ability to do what the fleet had done was something that should be held carefully, with both hands, and never treated as a simple thing. Okafor read the note. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she nodded once, folded the document, and placed it in the inside pocket of her uniform jacket. She kept it there for the rest of her life. The Vreth Dominion, in the year that followed the battle, was in a state of profound internal upheaval. The Emperor had survived. His government had not, in any form that resembled what it had been before. The military commanders who had planned the attack on Earth were gone. Some killed in the battle, some who had fled, some who had been handed over to the new Vreth Civil Council that formed in the power vacuum left by the collapse of the old structure. There was a period of genuine uncertainty about what the Dominion would become, and that uncertainty was uncomfortable and sometimes violent, and produced no clean answers. But in the ruins of the old institutions, something was growing. A young Vreth historian named Keth, who worked at what had been the Dominion's main academic institution before the battle, began a project that she described to her colleagues as simply trying to understand what had happened, not the battle itself. There was no shortage of people documenting that. She wanted to understand the longer history, how the Dominion had gotten to the point where attacking Earth had seemed like a reasonable decision. What had been missed? What had been ignored? What kind of thinking led a civilization to look at another living species and see only resources? She spent 3 years on the project. The document she eventually produced was long and careful and deeply uncomfortable for many Vreth readers, because it did not let anyone off the hook. It described the gradual normalization of contempt, the way generations of Vreth had been taught to see non-Vreth species as lesser, and how that teaching had made it easy, when the time came, to make the decision that had destroyed the Dominion's military and changed the shape of their civilization permanently. She wrote about humanity specifically with a particular kind of attention. She had spent time studying human history, something almost no Vreth scholars had done before her, and what she found had shaken her. Not the violence of it, though there was plenty of that. What had shaken her was the pattern, the way humans fell over and over to terrible lows and then came back, not because they were physically stronger than other species, not because they were smarter or more advanced or more virtuous, but because of something in the way they were made, some deep and stubborn refusal to accept that what had happened was the end of the story. She wrote one passage near the end of the document that was quoted more widely than anything else she ever wrote. She wrote that the galaxy had always assumed the most dangerous thing was a species that attacked when threatened. But that assumption, she said, had been wrong. The most dangerous thing was a species that waited, that remembered, and that chose its moment. A species for whom even a century was not too long to prepare for the right response. She closed the document with a simple statement, addressed to her own people. She wrote that they should be glad the humans had aimed only at what they aimed at. That based on everything she had studied, if humanity had wanted to do more, they could have. The choice not to had been exactly that, a choice. And choices made from that kind of position, she wrote, deserved to be understood as clearly as the capability that made them possible. The galaxy beyond Vreth was changing too. The Terran Sovereign Pact had grown to 41 member species by the end of the first year. The small and previously vulnerable members of the galactic community had found in the pact something they had never had before, a reliable answer to the question of what would happen if someone decided to threaten them. The answer was no longer probably nothing. The answer was now a Terran diplomatic vessel, appearing in your system, with a quiet, steady presence that every potential aggressor in the galaxy now understood the full meaning of. The bullying did not stop entirely. Old habits in old empires do not change overnight, but it became significantly rarer. The calculus had changed. The cost of threatening a small species that held pact membership was now attached to the image of the Vreth home system in the aftermath of the battle, and that image had a remarkable effect on decision-making across the eastern and central parts of the galaxy. Several previously aggressive regional powers chose in that year to pursue their territorial ambitions through economic negotiation rather than military pressure. Nobody announced this publicly. No one said, "We are changing our behavior because we are afraid of humanity." But everyone understood it. And the species who had spent decades being afraid those regional powers understood it too, and lived their lives a little differently because of it. In the small, quiet office she kept at the Terran Fleet Central Command Facility, now a permanent installation rather than a hidden one, Admiral Okafor read the reports that came in from the Pact member worlds. She read them carefully, the way she did everything. She tracked the political situations in the systems along the Pact's edges. She watched the movements of fleets and the patterns of economic pressure and the long, slow games that powerful civilizations play when they are calculating whether to push their boundaries or not. She was very good at reading those patterns, and what she read in the year following the battle told her something that she did not say out loud to anyone, but kept in the back of her mind where she kept all the things that needed to be held quietly. The galaxy was not, despite everything, a safe place. It would not become one because of what had happened at Wrath Prime. There would be other threats, other calculations, other moments when someone somewhere decided that the cost of aggression was worth paying. But she also read something else in those patterns, a hesitation that had not been there before, a pause before decisions were made, a recalculation of costs that now included a factor that had not been in anyone's models a year ago. She was quietly and without ceremony satisfied. The Yeln were a small species who lived on two worlds in a system near the outer edge of the known galaxy. They were pre-FTL. They had not yet developed the ability to travel between stars under their own power, though they were working on it and were perhaps 30 years away from achieving it. They were gentle, curious beings, deeply communal, with a complex and beautiful tradition of oral storytelling that had preserved their history for thousands of years. They were also completely unable to defend themselves against interstellar threats, and a regional power called the Gial Compact had been sending them increasingly aggressive diplomatic messages over the previous 2 years, with clear economic and territorial intentions behind the language. The Gial Compact was not a member of the Galactic Concord. They were not a member of the Terran Sovereign Pact. They were a medium-sized empire in a part of space that sat between the Concord's territory and the outer reaches, and they had a long history of pressuring smaller neighbors into unfavorable arrangements. Nobody had ever pushed back on them. They sent the Yeln a final ultimatum in the 12th month after the Battle of Reeth Prime. The message said that the Yeln would agree to the economic arrangements the Compact had proposed, or the Compact would begin protective operations in the Yeln system, which was a phrase that everyone, including the Yeln, understood to mean occupation. The Yeln did not have an interstellar communication system powerful enough to reach most of the galaxy, but they had, in the weeks before the ultimatum arrived, managed to send a weak signal in the direction of the nearest Pact-affiliated system, describing their situation. The signal was picked up by a relay station that forwarded it through the Pact communication network. It reached the Terran Fleet Command facility 17 days after it was sent. There was no drama in what happened next, no emergency meetings, no speeches. A single Terran diplomatic vessel, fast, sleek, bearing the markings of the Terran Sovereign Pact, was dispatched to the Yeln system. It arrived 4 days after departure, having used the faceslip drive to cross the distance in a fraction of the time the Gill Compact would have assumed was possible. The vessel appeared in the Yeln system and established a standard communication channel to all parties in the area. The Terran envoy's message was short. She identified herself and her vessel, stated that the Yeln had communicated a request for Pact representation, and indicated that the Terran Sovereign Pact was prepared to stand as a diplomatic guarantor of the Yeln's right to self-determination. Then she simply waited. The Gill Compact had a patrol vessel in the area, a standard military ship sent to maintain presence during the ultimatum period. Its captain received the Terran communication, looked at the hull markings of the vessel in front of him, and spent a long moment completely still at his command station. He knew those markings. Every military commander in any part of the galaxy knew those markings. His government had sent a detailed briefing to all patrol commanders 8 months ago following the battle at Reeth Prime, with a very simple central message. These are the markings of Terran vessels. Under no circumstances should any encounter with a Terran vessel be treated as routine. He looked at the markings for a long time. Then he opened a channel to Gill Compact Central Command and reported the situation. The response from Central Command took 4 hours. When it came, it contained exactly 2 words: "Come home." The patrol vessel turned and left the Yelm system. The ultimatum was not renewed. The economic arrangement proposals were quietly withdrawn from Compact diplomatic files. The Gill Compact made no public statement about any of it. In the Yelm system, on the surface of the larger of the 2 planets, word spread through the population that the threat had passed. People who had been afraid for months, who had listened to their government read the Compact's ultimatum and had wondered what they could possibly do about it, learned that something had happened in the sky above them, that a ship had come, that someone had stood next to them, and that standing had been enough. The Yelm did not have a tradition of statues or monuments. Their tradition of remembrance was oral. Stories told carefully and accurately, passed from generation to generation, preserved in the memory of people rather than the stone of buildings. They began in the weeks that followed to tell a new story. It was the story of the ship with the strange markings that had come from the far edge of the sky and had said, in the language of its presence rather than any spoken word, that the Yelm were not alone. That story would be told for a very long time. Far across the galaxy, in a plane office in a fleet command facility, Admiral Okafor received the report from the diplomatic vessel. She read it once, she set it down. She looked out of the small window that faced the lunar surface at the gray rock and the black sky beyond it, and she stayed like that for a moment. Then she added the report to the day's files and moved on to the next one. There was always more work to do. The galaxy had many languages. It had many laws, many gods, many ideas about how the universe should be arranged and who should sit at the center of it. It had civilizations that had been trading and fighting and growing and dying for tens of thousands of years. It was enormous and complex and often unjust and sometimes beautiful. And now it had learned something new. It had learned that the species it had dismissed, the small, fragile, too emotional, too warlike, barely interstellar creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable star, had been watching, had been learning, had been building quietly and patiently in the dark for a very long time, had been keeping records of every dismissal, every closed door, every vote against them, every moment when the galaxy had looked at them and decided they didn't matter. Humanity didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. They had tried that. They had asked politely. They had applied through the right channels. They had made their arguments and accepted the rejections, and come back the next year and tried again. They had spent decades playing the game the way the galaxy said the game was supposed to be played. The galaxy had taught them a different lesson, and humanity, as it always had, as it always would, had learned it. They had learned it completely, and they had learned it well. And now the whole galaxy was living in the very long, very quiet, very attentive shadow of that education. It did not make them cruel. It did not make them reckless. It made them exactly what they had always been, underneath everything. A species that remembered, that built, that endured, and that never under any circumstances gave up. The galaxy was silent, and in that silence, it was finally paying attention.